Thank you for attending the second of this semester's Psychology Department Speaker Series. This is the second of 4. We have 2 more next semester. I'm Dr. Frank Connor. I'm the chair of the Psychology Department. It is my pleasure today to introduce to you Dr. William Chopik. Dr. Chopik is an assistant professor at Michigan State University. He did his undergraduate work at the University of Illinois Champaign and his doctoral work at the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor. Please welcome today's speaker.
Great, well, thanks so much for having me. I'll be talking about dating in the modern age. But first I wanted to give a really brief introduction to the type of stuff my lab tends to do. So we generally look at a lot of different questions what it have to do with close relationships. So we try to take a pretty global perspective about how to do these things. So these are sort of how we like to think about questions, that there's this culture around you, that you have these relationships with your friends or your romantic partners, boyfriends and girlfriends, that you have a personality that makes those relationships better or worse. And then there's also tons of research suggesting looking at things like your health coordination and neuroendocrine functioning. So like I said, we have a bunch of papers looking at how relationships have changed both over time and across different cultures. We also have a bunch of papers looking at how different relationship styles affect people's well-being and happiness. And then we also have a lot of research looking at if the person you're married to, basically what's their personality like, does that affect how happy and healthy you are over time? And then we also follow, say, couples as they transition through having a child for the first time and how hormones of both people, say husbands and wives, change. And ultimately how these processes change from when you're very, very young, so your relationship with your parents, all the way to your sort of late life and older age and later relationships. But today is all going to be about dating. And there's been a lot of controversy, at least in the research field, about how to best go about studying these kind of things. So a lot of people go in with assumptions about what online dating is like. Some people really, really love it. You know, they meet their spouses, they have a lot of fun going on dates. And other people despise it. That's the worst thing that's ever happened. There's nobody to date. So today I'm actually going to be going over some principles about what other people find attractive, what you find attractive, and then ultimately if those are the type of things that are good for relationships. And the answer is that they might not all be as great as you think. So I just wanted to briefly talk about what makes people attractive from all of the studies that occur outside of the online dating context. So for years and years and years, we've tried to study why people are attracted to each other. And then there's been this advent of online dating. So dating sites like OkCupid, eHarmony, Match.com, FarmersOnly.com. And then I'll be talking a little bit later about mobile dating apps, which as college students you probably are a little bit familiar with, or maybe your friends use them. I won't ask who uses them, but perhaps your friends use them. But in terms of what predicts attraction offline, there's actually been a ton of studies looking at the exact qualities that predict attraction. So for example, what are the traits that people have? So are you a relatively nice person? Newsflash, don't be a jerk or an asshole. That's generally not a good thing for relationships. That's summarized like 60 years of research. We spent 60 years finding out if you're a jerk, if that's a bad thing. Turns out it is. Similarity, whether you think you're similar, and some people are very, very not compatible, but they think they are. If you're familiar with the person, so there's research showing that if you're kind of exposed to the same person over and over again, you start to like them, you start to find them attractive. There's a famous study where they looked at if you live relatively close to someone in a college dormitory, when you look at who those people are dating, most often time they're dating the people that they see on an everyday basis. Reciprocity, we like people who like us. There's also a newsflash. We tend to like people who are physically attractive, but that's not always a great thing for the people who are attractive. Proximity, you like to date people who are similar or live near you. This is really, really fascinating. So what happens in the situation when there's a chemistry between two people? People try to look at that. Synchrony, so do you sort of mesh well? And then this thing called self-disclosure. So basically, we like other people when they ask questions about us and when they disclose things about themselves. So I'll be just going over a few studies on a few of these characteristics to just give you a flavor of the type of stuff that we tend to do as relationships researchers. So for example, in terms of positive traits, a lot of people have a wish list for the types of things that they want in an ideal partner. I want someone who's caring, might be a good parent, there's actually been studies where they asked tons and tons of people, what do you think the most important qualities are in a relationship? So there's actually been a study of this, and these are the top things people think are the most attractive characteristics in people. So they like people who are sincere, who are honest, understanding, loyal, truthful, intelligent. Not surprisingly, these are all bad things that you don't want in a romantic partner or you don't want in a friend. Sense of humor was the 19th most important rated characteristic in the type of things that we like to see in a romantic partner. So basically, a lot of science has been dedicated to maybe there's characteristics that...
It's not working. We need to switch it.
Okay. I feel like a stand-up comedian. Wow, that's great. Great, thank you very much. Great, thank you. That's great. Okay, how do I use this? Okay. So there's been a lot of dedicated research trying to look at things like there's an old phrasing that maybe nice guys finish last, or maybe is there a point at which you can be too nice, especially in first date situations. A lot of studies have looked at that. So actually, there have been studies about this where they say give single women, for example, different descriptions of who they might want to date someday. So one example would be a description of a nice guy who wants to get in touch with his feelings and those of his partner. One is sort of the scientific empirical definition of what a jerk is in a dating context. So this is someone who keeps other people guessing, keeps them on their toes. He doesn't go in for all that touchy-feely stuff. So we tried to come up with a way in which you can ask people the type of individuals that they'd like to date. And by far, people rate the nice guy as more desirable to date and marry. And contrary to stereotypes, people like nice people more so than jerks. And basically, they've done a lot of different research on this, showing that it's independent about how attractive or unattractive they are. So a lot of times if someone is of average attractiveness, you'll still want to date them more than a really hot jerk. You'll want to marry the person who's nice and kind. And a lot of research that I'll be talking about today boils down to the type of stuff that you're interested in. So if you're looking for a relatively short-term relationship, a lot of times people weight physical attractiveness more. But if you're looking into long-term interests, like the type of person you want to marry, a lot of times people weigh things like kindness and love and caring sort of personality traits. But one of the reasons why we tend to like people is that we're similar to them, because there's a ceiling effect in which we actually don't like the people who are perfect. So we like people who are nice, we like people who are caring, but we really can't stand people who are perfect. And that's actually a really, really fascinating problem in the relationships world. And this is what's called the pratfall effect. So people are seen as more attractive if they have a little bit and tiny flaws inside themselves, because it makes them a little bit relatable. And this is because you could be perfect in every way, but you're at least a little humble about it. You have some sort of imperfections that aren't entire deal breakers for a lot of people. So I'll tell you about one particular study. It's the Jeopardy study, where people listen to recordings of people answering questions. And they varied, and there's been a lot of different variants of this particular study, but basically there's a perfect contestant who gets every question right. People don't love that person. However, in variants of the study, what happens is there's a person who keeps getting the questions right and then accidentally spills coffee all over themselves at the very end of the game, embarrassing themselves, and they're really, really nervous the whole time. We love that person. So we like the person who's relatively good, smart, caring, has a good personality, but they're not entirely perfect. They have some sort of embarrassment about themselves. And the reason this thing, called the pratfall effect, tends to work is because they're a little bit relatable. We see them as similar. You all like to see yourselves in a positive light. That's a known psychological bias. And when we look for romantic partners, we want to see ourselves in them. So basically we think, oh, if I'm affiliated with this person, they're gonna be really great. People will think highly of us. And basically a lot of research is dedicated to whether or not we try to seek out similar people. So that's why this tends to work. And the crucial question in this literature is whether you want someone who is similar to you or someone who's entirely different. So a lot of this is posed as, do birds of a feather flock together, or do opposites attract? And actually, there's a bunch of reasons why you might expect similarity to work out. So in one sense, if you're similar on a lot of things like your values and background, that's generally a good thing. Maybe you think, oh, we'll fight less because we care about the same thing. we were raised the same way, so we have a lot of the same personality traits. Oh, so I'm from Chicago, you might be from mid-Michigan or Western Michigan. Maybe if you find someone else from Central or mid-Michigan, you might be similar on a lot of things. The way this is typically tested, though, is that they'll bring you into a lab and they'll have you fill out a bunch of, say, personality questionnaires. They'll say, oh, I'm this outgoing, I'm this much adventurous, this is how anxious I am. And basically what they'll do is they'll bring you the survey of someone who's already done the study. And they say, hey, here's a person that's already done the survey that you just took, and here are their scores on it. So this is how anxious they are, how adventurous they are, how outgoing they are. But in reality, that person is made up. So basically, researchers circled a bunch of scores, and they lied to you to try to get you to see how attracted you'd be to that person. It's called the phantom other technique because the phantom is a ghost and doesn't exist. So it's called that very scary phrase. And this has really spawned a lot of the similarity research. So what they'll do is they'll manipulate those items on that questionnaire to either be really similar to you or very, very different. So even on things like social issues, so do you say, there's personal things like whether or not you want children, but then also things like, are you politically liberal or conservative? Do you support abortion? Or are you, pro-choice or pro-life? And a lot of people will point to anecdotes either in their own lives, if you say know people who are very, very different from one another but have been married for a long time. This is James Carville and Mary Madeline. They're two, do people know who these are? Could you raise your hand if you know? Okay, there's 5, okay, great. So actually they're political consultants. So a long time ago, there was a president named Bill Clinton, and James Carville worked on his campaign. And Mary Madeline worked on George Bush's campaign and a few other people. So basically, they're very, very different. They're political operatives and consultants, so they have very, very different values. There's a scenario where they probably argue all the time, but they've also been married a really, really long time. And we asked them, how do you stay together? And they've given interviews about how this, most of the interviews they give together are like, how do you like each other? Don't you hate each other? A lot of it is dedicated to the relationship, and what they'll say is we match on a lot of other values and characteristics. So yeah, politics is our day job, but the fact that we're really similar, that's what we really bond over. So people often say maybe it's best if people complement each other. So if someone is particularly shy, they might recommend them going out with someone who's really extroverted. Maybe someone in a relationship is more dominant versus submissive. This is what's called complementarity. So in a given situation, maybe someone becomes a little more dominant versus submissive, but in general, similar people tend to find one another. So in terms of birds of a feather flocking together or opposites attracting, even in the case of people who are very different politically, it's generally the sense that similarity matters more. Okay. So like I said, similarity matters for a lot of different reasons. One thing is that we assume that it'll be good for you, so that you will fight less, or when you do fight, it'll be constructive. So we basically also think if someone's similar, they're more likely to like us. So if you know someone who's really similar to you, you already know on paper they're gonna like me. So they're gonna like the sports teams I like, they're gonna like my thoughts on social issues, they're gonna like my hometown, if say we both came from it, or they'll feel the same about my hometown, at least. We'll both hate it or both love it. So there's a lot of different ways in which similarity would predict attraction. So what they'll do is they'll do additional other phantom studies, and they'll find that, in general, we're the ones who seek out similarities. So it's basically they'll give them a questionnaire and they'll say, hey, would you want to date this person? And they'll say, indeed, yes. And if they're dissimilar, then they won't. So in terms of another thing that people tend to find attractive, one is basically being physically attractive, and I'm not going to lie to you and tell you that looks aren't important. I'm sorry that this is the first time you might have heard of this, but physically attractive people have a lot of benefits. We tend to like those who are more attractive, and I'll tell you what that means. And basically, people do end up worrying about being rejected, especially by attractive people, but the really interesting thing is that people have looked at how partners match and how similarly attractive they are. So basically, is there some sort of similarity happening there? So there's a sense in which maybe you think the same things about social issues, But there's a sense in which maybe people who are similarly attractive or not also match. And there's actually a lot of theory, both anecdotally and then also scientifically. So there's a show called How I Met Your Mother. So it's about a group of friends and Ted Mosby finding love. And they came up with this theory, actually, the reacher versus the settler. So what they say is that every relationship has a reacher and a settler. This will be offensive to some people, but it says every good relationship has a reacher and a settler. One person reaches for someone out of their league, and the other one settles for someone below theirs. So this is a little bit of a kind of, if you blow this out of proportion, it seems like there's, every relationship. There's actually been entire studies looking at if attractive people match. And actually, according to this article, there's a scientific number we can attach to that. So people generally aim for those that are at least 25% more attractive than they are. So actually, when you're going through online dating profiles or you see people dating for the first time, there's a general sense in which they're probably similar looking, oh, that's an attractive couple. But there's also a sense in which we try to at least reach for people who are a little bit more attractive than us. So there's another sense in which we're actually asking more and more people out that are more physically attractive. So people match on kind of physical attractiveness and also try to aim for those who are more physically attractive than them. But there's also another thing where physical attraction isn't just good for dating. There's a bunch of really fascinating research to suggest that it's not only does it translate to success in dating relationships, but it actually gives a lot of other benefits. So there's what is beautiful is good stereotype. So basically, when you meet an attractive person and you ask people's opinions about them, you often rate attractive people as smarter, friendlier, and nicer overall. But it doesn't just stop there. So it's actually generally the case that attractive people have a better chance of getting a job after they go on an interview. Once they get the job, they get paid more money. And actually, they're less likely to be convicted of crimes, and when they are, they're given shorter sentences. So there's a sense in which we have these thoughts about attractive people that they're generally amazing and good. However, it's not all good. So for example, physically attractive people are often judged as more vain and promiscuous, so they have sex with a lot of people. You think that about attractive people. And they're more likely to think, people are more likely to lie to them, so in a way to curry favor with this person that they think is beautiful and good. So there's a sense in which actually when these people go out on the dating market, a lot of people want to date them, but there's a sense in which maybe the people they're trying to date are a little disingenuous. So I just told you, people are more likely to lie to them. And so that's not necessarily an overall great package. So actually, surprisingly, there's a few different things that people tend to agree on what makes someone attractive. So there's actually criteria where they'll manipulate the features of various faces and bodies. So men tend to like women with large eyes, smaller noses, and high cheekbones. For women, these are sort of in heterosexual relationships. Men with a wider smile and a broad jaw. And there's a million reasons why they came up with these criteria. But they ended up testing them, and they found that not only do these kind of characteristics change in how attractive people find them from across different cultures and then over time, but they even found that some infants show this preference. So they study this by looking at how long infants look at things. So what happens is infants will look at more attractive people longer. So it's actually something that occurs really early. So they get lost in this attractive person's face or eyes. And then I'll also just end this particular part by talking a little bit about this situation, which is where a lot of the magic happens. It's also one of the hardest things to study, kind of the chemistry and the spark between two people. But there have been a few different efforts on this. One is that, there's the situation, like I told you before, if you live relatively close to someone, you're more likely to date them. So it's very likely, say, going to school at community college here, you might meet a student, not at this lecture, but maybe other lectures, and you fall in love with them and you get to know them. There's a sense in which that's how people find people to date. But there's also another thing called the misattribution of arousal, which is a very famous social psychology effect in which when people sort of are in a situation where they're physiologically aroused, whether it be kind of a heartbeat, or excitable, there's a sense in which maybe that translates to how they judge other people. So what happens, it's called misattribution. When you feel your heart pumping, you might think it's because of the person you're talking to, when in fact your heart could just be pumping for another reason. So you sort of misattribute that to how you're feeling. So I'm sure all of us have the experience when we're sitting next to someone who's really attractive, and we might feel, say, butterflies in your stomach, or you might start sweating uncontrollably, and your hands are like soaking wet, and you're short of breath. There's a sense in which we get aroused, physically, not just sexually, but physically when you sort of are around attractive people. And there's actually a famous study to this effect. So this is a very famous suspension bridge in Vancouver. And it's a really, really creative study. So the authors thought that maybe actually if you arouse somebody physically and then give them the opportunity to interact with someone attractive, maybe they'll misattribute this. So what happens is they had people walk through this very, very long bridge. And they had a control condition where they walked on a very, very short bridge. But the idea is this is a suspension bridge over a really large chasm. So it's really anxiety provoking, even if you're not necessarily afraid of heights. So this particular study was done with men. So basically they had men walk this entire bridge, and at the very end of the bridge was an attractive research assistant. And basically she would ask a bunch of questions, they would write stories about pictures, and then essentially, and they didn't tell the research assistant that they were doing this, but they said, the research assistant would say, here's my phone number, call me if you have any questions. And then the study was basically over. And the dependent variable is whether or not they called this attractive woman within the next couple of weeks. And people who walked along the really, really long bridge, so they had their heart pumping, they were pretty nervous, they were more likely to call this attractive person that they met on the end of the bridge. And the idea is that they misattributed this meaning of this attractive person to the fact that their heart was already beating, that they're already a bit aroused. And that's why they misattribute it to the situation. So there's plenty of things like that that also affect our romantic interest in people. So I will also say it's the type of things you're looking for matters. So again, if you're interested in short-term relationships, you look for different things. I will say it also varies by physical location. So men who are interested in short-term relationships generally have lower standards. So when you ask them who's the type of person you say would like to date or you would like to sleep with, men who are interested in short-term relationships have lower standards, whereas women have the opposite. So they actually have higher standards. And a lot of this is done with physical attractiveness, but also just traits, like they want better people. However, the context also matters. So they've done studies where they've asked how selective people would be in different locations. So they actually went to a bar, went to a party, went to a library, and went to a church. And the standards were actually very different. So when you're at a bar and a party, women's standards were extremely high, but they were much lower if they were sitting at the library or in the church. And actually, men were entirely different. So they had lower standards at bars and parties, but then if you put them in libraries and churches, they all of a sudden have all these values and morals that they want someone to settle down with and spend the rest of their lives with and have children with. So there's a sense in which the general context matters as well. However, you all came here because the title was called Dating in the Modern Life. So I wanted to tell you a bit about kind of how relationship science has responded to the basically advent of online dating. And actually, it's been a challenge for relationship researchers because since these different platforms have evolved, it's fundamentally changed how we meet people. So, from 1940 to 2000, the most common way that people met were through friends. So oftentimes, friends would set other friends up, or you'd meet at some social event or some gathering. That's how people met. A lot of other things happened, so people would meet at bars and restaurants, through coworkers. It was very common to meet people at work. And then basically, over time, there's this really dramatic increase of how people meet via online dating, and it's especially true for same-sex couples as well. Partially because online dating is good if you're looking for a ton of people who want to date. So if anything else is true, online dating is great for that. It brings you to a website with a bunch of people who want to go on dates. So that, in that sense, things like Tinder and OkCupid, they're good for that. But there's a sense in which the ways in which we're meeting other people are declining. So you're not going to meet as many people through friends. Friends won't recommend you as much. They might direct you to online dating instead. So basically, a lot of research in my lab is dedicated to what predicts what's called relationship initiation, which is how do you start relationships, and maintenance, what keeps you in relationships. So, like I said, people tend to match on similarity. So when you're in like an online dating context, a lot of times you look for similarities in the profile. So I say, oh, you like to go to parties, I like to go to parties, or you like to go to music shows, I like to go to music shows. There's a sense in which you might merge on other interests. So, oh, you like to travel and try new foods and try new adventures. That's really great. Perhaps you like the same TV shows. That's something we can bond over and talk about the whole time. You know, maybe you like the same music as me. I hope you don't like that. But if you did, presumably there's people out there who like that band, and they're looking for other people that like that band, and they can live happy ever after alone. They can live together. But there's a sense in which after this initial assumption, people who started online dating companies are interested in using that information and predicting who likes whom and who would be in the most successful relationship. So a lot of times when you sign up for an online dating website, you'll fill out tons of measures. So I'm guessing a lot of you have at least tried this or are familiar with questionnaires that you fill out when you start. So researchers will take that data and try to figure out who are the best matches. And they'll do so in a lot of different ways. So they'll take things like your attitudes, your values, your background, and your personality. And actually, there's a sense in which they'll look at who's already married and the happiest people in those relationships, and then they'll see, oh, well, if these people are happy, maybe that's who you should sort of try to emulate. So we know what makes successful relationships that are already in existence. When people are looking for new people to date, let's try to get them to emulate those same things. So what they do is they find that couples who are similar, couples tend to be correlated in their life satisfaction. So basically, as one person gets happier, so does their partner. There's also a sense in which your health behavior is coordinated. So if you've ever had a partner that starts a diet or starts exercising more, it's usually the case that their partner is quick to follow. So in general, people are coordinated in the type of stuff they do. There's also some evidence that you're coordinated in what's called neuroendocrine functioning. So what'll happen is when you go through specific stressors, a lot of times you and your partner might respond in similar ways. You get stressed out to a similar degree. And you can see that on the biological level. And the idea is that maybe if you respond in certain ways and you change in certain ways, that makes for a good relationship. But in reality, there's actually a lot of mixed evidence for whether or not you'll be happier with these type of people, those who are similar to you. There's actually a lot of mixed evidence. It's also cross-sectional, which means you just measure people at one point in time. You don't measure whether or not this similarity, if you end up with someone who is as extroverted as you are or as nice as you are, they haven't really looked at whether or not that predicts good things like you being happier over time. There's a sense in which they just ask dating couples, hey, are you happy right now? So actually, that's going to be the first types of data that I'm going to show you today. It's a really, really simple question. Are couples happier if they're more similar on things like personality? So if you match with someone who has similar personality traits, again, if you're both shy people, if you're both really adventurous, does that predict good things in your relationship? So what we did is we got a very, very large study of people. So we had 2,600 couples. These people had been married for a pretty long time, about 20 years. So we had people who had been married for, say, 30 and 40 years, and then people who have only been married for like 1 or 6 months. And we had them fill out a bunch of different measures. We had them fill out what's called a measure of Big 5 personality characteristics. So personality psychologists think that everything about your personality can be boiled down to these 5 things. That's a separate talk for a different day. But basically, they think conscientiousness is a big thing. So basically, do you finish tasks on time? Are you generally considerate? Do you do all the work that you're assigned? Do you show up to class on time? These kind of things. Agreeableness, which is just how nice you are. Disagreeableness is how mean you are. Neuroticism is neuroticism, how anxious you are. Openness to experience it. Basically, do you like new experiences? Do you seek out adventurous situations? And then extroversion, which is how outgoing you are. And then we asked them to fill out a bunch of different measures. So how happy they were on the whole, how happy they are in this very moment. So if I ask you now, how great do you feel right now? That would be that answer. Experienced affect is also where we kind of ping them throughout the day, and you ask, how happy are you now? How happy are you now? And there's a bunch of other things, so how happy they are in relationship, if they think they're doing really well in their life overall, like, oh, my work is doing great, and my relationship is doing great. So one thing we found is that for you, regardless of who your partner is, all of these things are associated with better relationship satisfaction. So if you're a conscientious person, so you're considerate, like to finish things on time,
that's generally correlated with being happier in a relationship. And you don't have to think that hard to think why that's the case. So for example, if you've ever been in a relationship with someone who forgot your birthday, that kind of stinks. But conscientious people remember that. They put that stuff in their calendar. You know, they're going to remember every time. They're going to get you a gift. Nice, if you're nice, in general, you have better relationships. If you're extroverted, that's generally good. You like socializing with people, and now you're with someone who you have to socialize with. Open to experience, you like kind of new experiences. And people high in anxiety generally are not as satisfied. And then we actually looked at maybe the characteristics of who you're married to or who you're dating. Maybe that also predicts how happy you are. And the answer is if you're with someone who's conscientious, that's generally a good thing. You're happier, you think your relationship will last longer. If you're paired with someone who's really, really anxious, that's generally not a good thing. Oftentimes you feel like you're walking on glass or tiptoeing around glass, trying not to upset them. But then the really fascinating thing is that if you look at how correlated members are, so basically are both of them extroverted, are both of them high in conscientiousness, high in all these traits, you see that actually it doesn't matter that much. So these are what are called standardized regression coefficients, and they're very, very small, so they're almost close to 0. And the idea is that this runs counter to a lot of things about online dating, for example. Sorry, these are just additional analyses. So maybe similarity matters more if you've been together longer. So if you stand the test of time and you're similar, maybe that matters more. It doesn't. Maybe they're only apparent when you're older. So if you're in a second or third marriage, you made a bunch of mistakes. That's also not true. Are they more important for men or women? The answer is mostly no. And I bring this study up for the very reason that there's a lot of online dating companies that specifically sell the idea that we know what similarity is and we're looking for someone who's similar to you, and that's what's going to make for the best relationship. And I just showed you that it doesn't really matter. So you could make the point that online dating companies are making tons and tons of money selling people science that doesn't exist. I could make that point, but I'm not going to. But there's a sense in which if you sign up for these companies, you sign up for a service that they're going to be giving you a bunch of matches based on questions that you filled out, that the other person filled out. And they subjected it to this algorithm or this way of computing similarity. And at least for couples that have been married for really, really long amounts of time, which is sort of what a lot of people want. They want a long-term relationship that'll last a very long time. It doesn't apparently matter that much for how happy you are. The things that do matter is if you're relatively emotionally balanced, if you're with someone who's not a huge jerk. You know, that's kind of, it's very, very boring to hear, but like try not to date assholes all the time. Like that's generally a good thing that's going to be good for you in the future. So I'm hoping you're all taking notes, but you know, that's something that is so obvious. But when you actually look at what online dating is promising, you see that actually the science isn't particularly there in terms of how much happiness it's causing. So rant over. Okay. But in terms of kind of newer dating markets, that's sort of online dating where you sit at a desktop or a laptop and you fill out all these questionnaires about yourself and the things you want and if you're religious or not. But then there's another type of online dating or mobile dating, and that's through mobile dating apps. And there's actually a lot of them. So there's really, really popular ones that I'm sure you know. There's a service called Happen, which connects you with people you walk past during the day but didn't interact with usually. So these are people that are around you. Oh, it gets much, much worse. Okay, so there's that. You know Bumble, right? So there's really, really similar swiping program, and that has the added element of women messaging first as sort of another kind of protective factor for women. Coffee Meets Bagel. Hinge, which matches you with friends of friends. So there's a Hinge that connects you to. So that makes some people a little bit more uncomfortable. For a while, there was a service called Down. This is interesting. So this connects you with your Facebook friends who they know are single. So these are people that you're Facebook friends with that this online dating website gets access to with their relationship status. So the people you see on there are people you know, people you might have known for a long time, and their relationship status. So there's also Grindr, which was one of the first location-based ones. So all of these are like location-based. So it'll give you people around you that are available to date. I will say that there are other services that gear towards specific interests. So if you are a music lover, and you all seem like great Nickelback fans, if you are that, you can download this particular app, or if you both like Taylor Swift or what music is popular now? Chainsmokers? Okay. Yeah, see, I know stuff. I will tell you there's a Tinder for dogs, and when I first read about this, I thought, how do dogs date other dogs? That doesn't make any sense, and that's actually not what it is. Obviously, it seems obvious now, but it's dog owners who want to date other dog owners, which makes a lot of sense. So, we all love our dogs. If you want to ask me 2 hours of questions, we do research on dog personality and how it changes based on the stuff you do. Like, people love dogs, and for a lot of people, this defines their life. So like I said, this is a particular interest. So you all know dogs. Being a dog owner or cat owner tells you about someone's personality a lot of the time. So there's that. The most popular one I'm sure that you know of is Tinder. So it's by far the most popular mobile dating app at the time. So for those of you who are unfamiliar, a lot of times you are provided with profiles of people where you're given their photo and maybe a little bit more information about them. For example, their age and location and where they work, or some details about where they're from. If you then click on the profile, it expands a little bit, and they might give some sort of quote about their life or their interests. So this is Ron Swanson, some of you know. So his bio, he chose to say, "You had me at Meat Tornado, and just give me all the bacon and eggs you have," which are quotes from the show. Gives you how far away they are often. My graduate students made this one of me when we were making all these images, so they have a pretty good sense of humor. So I lost a bet and had to put this in my talk for today. So I blame them. This was against my will. Sorry. So that's what I look like. So similar, basically, you go through all these profiles, and then you're given an initial choice. You can swipe right or left. So if you want to start a conversation with them, you'll swipe right. And if not, you'll swipe left. There's other different variants of this. So there are things called super likes. There's different services where you can go back to people that you didn't like, or block people that you accidentally swiped right on. There's a lot of different ways that you could do this. So to give you a little bit of research on Tinder, so these are researchers who have asked people about using Tinder. So there's a sense in which people generally enjoy using Tinder. So 75% of people say that Tinder has been providing them with partners that are either on par or better than they meet in everyday life. So a lot of people go on online dating sites or mobile dating apps to get more options, or to get people who are unambiguously interested in dating. It has a higher proportion of male users than female users. So 2/3 of the users on Tinder are men. They are mostly single, and I say mostly because anywhere between 12 and 30% of Tinder users are already in a relationship, but on the dating app. And we have no idea why they're on it. So in one sense, they could just be looking for someone to sleep with. Some people oftentimes treat Tinder as a game, so they enjoy swiping. Others use it as a self-esteem boost, so they want to be liked. The average user is about 27 years old, but most of them range from 18 to 34. I said they mostly range from 18 to 34. And there's a perception that it's a hookup app, so a lot of people think of Tinder as, hey, if you're looking for someone to sleep with, this is a thing you can use. However, maybe there's a little bit more than that. So the majority of Tinder users actually say they're looking for a long-term relationship when they use mobile dating apps like Tinder. So there's a sense in which there's this perception, and then maybe actually why people are using it. So actually, we specifically wanted to look at Tinder as a way in which you can predict things like attraction, the type of things that people are looking for when they want to date. So we came up with sort of a laundry list of things you can maybe use Tinder to predict. So for example, we thought that, if the photo you're looking at is of an attractive person, you'll probably swipe right. That kind of makes a lot of sense. There's also some research, if you think you're super attractive, you would be more likely to swipe left on a lot of people because you have really high standards. So there's some research on that. Symmetry, and I mean symmetry as in facial symmetry. So we like people who have similar faces, and there's a long history of this in psychology. Attachment security. So basically, are you a relatively secure person who's good in relationships, or are you the type of person who doesn't like relationships and avoids them? Sociosexuality, which is this interesting trait. Are you the type of person who likes engaging in short-term relationships? So and generally when you look for people to date, you want someone short-term, casual hookups, oftentimes outside of the context of relationships. I will also say we looked at race in particular, the effect of being Black or African American. And this is sort of an uncomfortable truth in the romantic relationships literature, is that people tend to assort based on race, so they tend to date within their own race. And actually, when people try to go outside their race, they oftentimes struggle to find people to date. So this is actually data from OkCupid. They surveyed they basically used data of who sends messages and who receives messages. So if you look along the top, it's the people who are replying, who they reply to. And if you look along the diagonal, it's usually how people match. So these are Asian women sending a message and whether or not an Asian man responds. So Black women sending a message and whether a Black woman responds. All the way down, kind of the diagonal. And if you look, there's this really long red bar, and the colors are basically who responds to whom. So the green boxes all say that given the distributions of who's on OkCupid, you'd expect that that's how many people that they would message. And if the boxes are red, it means that they're getting fewer replies than you would expect. So when they send out this many messages, you'd expect that they get some number back. And if the box is red, it means that they're not getting as many back. So it looks like at least Black women are experiencing some sort of penalty on OkCupid where there's evidence that they might be sending more messages than the average person, and they're getting even fewer replies back. So here's an uncomfortable truth where we set up an online dating website like this, and you let people kind of send messages to each other, but there's a sense in which some groups are not receiving messages at the same rate of other groups. So we actually wanted to look at this with Tinder, and we wanted to see if maybe people of different racial ethnic groups also experience some sort of penalty on Tinder as well. Single status versus partnered. So I told you anywhere between 12 and 30% of people on Tinder are in relationships. If you're in a relationship on Tinder, one assumption you might make is that because you already have a partner, maybe you'll be super choosy and swipe left a bunch. So we actually tested that. There's a bunch of other things about people's faces and bodies. So if you have a relatively dominant looking face, masculine faces are things that women find attractive. Feminine faces are things that men find attractive. Your width to height ratio, which is basically the shape of your face. Is it wider than it is longer? So some people have relatively wider faces. And then how prototypical your face is. So does your face match the average person of your age, gender, and race? So there's all these different things we looked at. And what we did is we actually built a Tinder task in the lab. So we programmed a task. We also ran it online where people were given faces of people sequentially. So basically, do you want to date this person, swipe right or left? So we did 2 studies in particular, so about 1,000 people, and then we've since done 2 more that have, we're up to nearly 3,000 participants. And actually, when we do this type of task, we can drill down to the millisecond how fast and slow people are swiping right and left, which is pretty cool. You can measure how fast people are doing it. And what we found is that people are really, really fast to tell you who they don't want to date. So they're doing it in 0.6 of a second. They exactly know who they don't want to date. They take a bit longer when they're considering who they want to date, but not much longer. They're taking about a second to decide. So within seeing a photo, they have a pretty good idea of the type of person they want to date. Swiping rates were pretty low, but men were more likely to swipe right than women. This is also consistent with a lot of other studies that have shown this as well. This is a plot, actually, and I sorted it based on how big of an effect it had on whether or not you swipe right. So if the dot and interval are above 0, it means it's predicting if you swipe right. And if it's to the left of the 0, it means you're swiping left. You're more likely to swipe left. So I told you before that attractive people have benefits in dating contexts. That's like the #1 predictor of who gets swiped on Tinder. And again, that's not super surprising when you have no other information about somebody other than what they look like. What they look like is probably going to drive your decision, right? There's another effect in which if you are the same race as the person, you're more likely to swipe right. Again, if you look back to who's messaging whom on OkCupid. If you're a man, you're more likely to swipe right. I just told you that. If you're open to dating, it sort of predicts you swiping right more. If you're open to a lot of casual sex, it's a little bit swiping right more. But it's generally the case that people aren't. Sometimes people call it a shotgun approach where they just swipe right on everybody. That's generally not happening to most people. If you look on the other side, if you think you're attractive, you're more likely to swipe left. And then we also see this racial disparity where Asian people, which was not previously found, and especially African American targets actually were swiped left on more. And this is controlling for all these things at the same time. So there's a sense in which if you're very, very attractive, but still a person of color, you still experience this penalty. And this is sort of the more controversial part about Tinder, is that there's been a lot of blog posts about maybe this is an app that's specifically geared towards one population, say, for example, predominantly white college students. So there's been other dating apps that have sprouted up catering to these specific communities. But when you just look at how people are responding on average, why they swipe right, why they swipe left, this is basically how the data are panning out in terms of what's predicting what. We replicated this again, a second and a third time. So again, attraction mattered, being a man mattered, having the same race, and again, the same penalty for African American individuals. We also looked at all sorts of things like your personality. So maybe you're the type of person that likes a certain somebody. When you're swiping, actually, that didn't predict anything. So again, when in this specific context, when you're looking at photos and swiping right and left, it doesn't really matter the type of person you are or the things you're looking for, if you're single or partnered. A lot of it is based on race and attraction. So there's been a bunch of other different features that Tinder has introduced. So like I said, there's a super like feature. And then they also introduced this really, really fascinating feature where they'll tell you if the person you're looking at has already liked you. And that might seem super simple, like a quick change, but actually it opens up a ton of questions that you can test from a relationships perspective. And there's two main theories that it can allow you to test. So there's a sense in which you like people who like you. And actually this was probably Tinder's thinking where when you tell someone that they've already been liked, maybe there's a sense of which, oh, well, if they like me, I'm already think of them positively. Maybe I'm more likely to swipe right. So that's probably what they introduced it as a feature to kind of narrow down your selection. Because a lot of people will use Tinder and they'll think that it's hopeless. And there's basically, you'd already have to guess if someone had liked you. But that's what the whole app is based on. If two people like each other, it allows them to then message each other. Sorry, I didn't say that earlier. You have to both like each other to start talking. But then there's another thing you can test, which is called the rose-tinted glasses effect. And this idea is that if you know if someone likes you, maybe it actually changes how you perceive them. Maybe all of a sudden you start to see them in a different light. If you didn't know that they liked you, you might have swiped left, but maybe, hey, they already said that they liked me. Maybe as I start to look at their photo, I start to think about what our lives together would be like. Maybe the imperfection on their face turns from a weird thing to a beautiful feature-defining thing. Maybe I think of how we'd spend the rest of our lives together and the white picket fence that we would share. And actually, you can test this in a lot of different models that we've been able to run. So part of it is that ignoring what people look like and all the features about them, if someone likes you, in general, you should just like them back. So that's Tinder's perspective, is that on average, this will just help people. But then there's another thing in which maybe it also affects how long you take to swipe. So maybe you spend more time on the app. Maybe you think more about it. Maybe after you both like each other, you're quicker to then message the person because you think that they fundamentally change how you saw them. Maybe you saw them as more attractive. And at least in our studies, we're finding much more support for this possibility. The idea is that we like people who like us. And that's sort of a big deal that's really rattled relationship science for a long time. We don't really know why we like who we like. One of the things is that we like people who say, hey, I want to date you. That's one thing that we know now, thanks to Tinder, of all places. So like I said, a lot of this is really intuitive and probably not shocking to a lot of you. After all, you've probably lived your whole life knowing that attractive people have benefits and want to be people's partners. But there's a general sense there's a lot of other things that happen on these platforms. So I told you that we tend to match with people who are similar to us. And a lot of effort has been focused on whether or not you share values or if you share personality traits. So not only did I show you that that doesn't matter, but it's generally the case that things like attraction and race matter way, way more. And actually, we don't really study those things when we talk about things like online dating, especially not the race effects. There's also some really, really fascinating research on Tinder now. And a lot of sociologists have pointed this out. When people are swiping right tons and tons and seeing just oftentimes hundreds of people that, and maybe you also think this way, when you see tons and tons of people, you start to think of them less as people and more like products, like you're almost shopping for a partner. And you kind of forget the fact that these people have entire lives outside of this app. They have likes and dislikes. They've had life experiences that are probably similar to yours. But there's a sense in which maybe we start to dehumanize them. They're sort of just another person, random person that I'll never interact with. And there's actually some research to show that as you view more and more photos, you actually get more and more choosy. So you start to reject more and more. And that's what this particular study looked at. So they varied how many photos people saw, and then their likelihood of swiping right. And this up here is men, so men swipe more than women. I told you that before. But actually, when you get to about, anywhere between the 25th photo you see, you sort of bottom out. So you start right away being relatively open to the people you see, but as you see more and more people, you start to decline in whether or not you want to date them. So you're less likely to swipe right. And this is really fascinating because part of the idea of Tinder is to give you more options. And this study is showing that more options aren't helping because you reject them after you saw the first 30. The first 30 might have been better, but probably not. So we've identified some of the ingredients for what goes into attraction, what makes people a good partner. But chemistry historically has been hard to test. So when you meet someone for the first time and you think they're beautiful and you want to be friends or date them, we don't have a really great idea of that process. And part of it, it's really hard to measure. Like we don't really know what it is. There's no measure for butterflies in your stomach. We haven't developed that yet. So like I said, companies often posit similarity measures, but they might be overselling their methods. Part of it is because it's a huge secret. So again, a lot of companies have copyrights on these sort of algorithms. But like I said, at the very least, I told you that online dating is a platform in which a lot of people go on it because they want to date, and that's a good thing. So if you give more people more opportunities to date, they'll date more. And dating applications can reveal additional things that previous studies couldn't. So I told you early on that the earliest studies gave people a piece of paper that the experimenter filled out in a separate room and lied to the participant. It's evolved so much that we've gone beyond that basic questionnaire and we were giving people actually Tinder-like dating apps to kind of swipe and measure their actual behavior. And that's led to really fascinating things. Now we've sort of at least given some expectations for that rose-tinted glasses effect. So that's something that's been in the literature a long time. And we found that just being liked by someone is way more important than you transforming how you think of other people. But maybe I should have started with this, but a lot of you might be wondering why this is so important. And this is where I'd like to sort of broaden out and talk a little bit more about why relationship science is so valuable. So when you ask people why relationships are important, the first thing that they don't necessarily think of is that it's good for your health. So there's a very, very famous study finding that as you have more, say, social support or you're more integrated in your social networks, you actually live to a longer age. So on average, it saves your life. This is another graph showing how important different factors are for when you die and how unhealthy you are. At the top are things like social relationships, high versus low support. So do you feel supported? Do you feel integrated? So the longer the bar is, the more influential it is. And that apparently, according to this particular analysis, is showing that it's more important than, say, smoking regularly on a daily basis. Consuming alcohol, taking various vaccines, being physically active, that's down here. So in a way, actually, close relationships ultimately confer health benefits. And sometimes we're not entirely sure why, but we're working on it. There's also a sense in which relationships give us a lot of support, especially during the particularly tough times in life. And that fills our lives with a sense of meaning and purpose. There's also a sense in which you can actually track relationships and how they change when really terrible things happen. So in this particular study, they looked at things like marriage rates on a population average after really terrible events happen. So Hurricane Hugo was this event. And they found that actually among individuals who lived the closest to the site most affected, marriage rates in the following year actually spiked. So there's a sense in which we sort of get together in times of extreme pressure and very, very serious situations, and it led to actually more relationships. But there's a sense in which external stressors can also cause really bad things. So here's the same graph, but are showing you divorce rates. So there's a sense in which the broader hurricane might be harming some relationships. Again, we don't entirely know what's happening. Part of it is because it's hard to study. In our lab in particular, we looked at how discrimination that you experience outside of a relationship affects your relationship. So actually, we called it vicarious discrimination because a lot of the negative experiences of one partner bleeds over and affects the mood and emotions of their current partner, even though that partner didn't experience discrimination directly. So we look at those type of projects in our lab. But there's a general sense in which you ask people who have been married a long time or are even on their second or third relationship, they feel like they've really won the lottery when they meet someone that they feel very strongly about. There's also a sense that relationships are very hard. So they take an inordinate amount of work. You know, you win the lottery, but then you're left with a person that you have to maintain a relationship with a very long time. But there's a sense in which that initial love can lead to really great things. So there's a great kind of collection of studies looking at how love changes across the course of a relationship. So really early on, it's very, very passionate. And actually, we find that as passion declines, things like companionate forms of love, so the idea of you think of your partner as a lifelong friend, those kind of things increase. So overall, passion tends to fade, but then some parts of relationships get better. There's a sense in which maybe bonding is something that occurs across the lifespan and can confer a lot of benefits to us as well. There's also a time in which you need to spend time together for a relationship to work. There's also really terrible times in which when relationships end, they can be really harmful for your happiness and your well-being. And a lot of people who have gone through any sort of breakup can attest to how much this can really disrupt your life. But ultimately, you're looking for that special person to end up with, and online dating companies have tried to provide a bunch of services that'll hopefully lead to you finding the one. But the idea is that you want to find the person that you are meant to be with, but then can also work towards that relationship and rekindle things in your relationship. So a lot of science is dedicated to rekindling or resparking relationships. But in general, it is worth noting that I talked a lot about today of what makes for a good relationship, an initial relationship, or why people end up together, how can they keep going. But I will also say that not all relationships are meant to last. And a lot of efforts in our lab are also to get dedicated to finding out what are the best ways in which you can end relationships in the smartest ways that hurt the fewest amount of people. So with that, I'll just tell you that our lab in general is interested in how relationships affect people across the lifespan. If you're ever interested in this type of research, I have a few cards, or if you ever want to get interested or involved in the research, we always need help, and they're really fun projects that we work on. We meet couples and they tell us their life stories of love and loss, and it's really an amazing experience. So with that, I will thank you, and I'm happy to take any questions.